Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the art of observation. I'm an observer. I observe people and their behaviors, and then I comment on them. And over the past few weeks, ever since we crossed the COVID 1-year mark, I've observed, in general, people are more relaxed. It's as if a big collective sigh of relief has been let loose. In Israel, that sigh is even more pronounced and official. Restrictions have been officially loosened. If not completely lifted, then on their way to being lifted. In the United States, it's more a grassroots type of easing up, both attitudinally and behaviorally. Certainly, the United States cannot compete with Israel in terms of the numbers of people vaccinated. No country can. But for a country as large as the United States, its numbers too are pretty impressive. 114 million people, 114, 436, and 39 Americans have received their first dose. That's 34% of Americans. 62 million, or 19% have received both doses. Given the numbers of diehard anti-vaxxers, those figures are even more impressive. For me, synagogues are a microcosm of the world. I intentionally attend services in different synagogues, populated by different groups of attendees in varying locales, and observe. And I have observed in synagogues, since Purim, there has been a significant change in tone and feeling. Since Passover, there has been a change in behaviors. In most synagogues that I have attended, Mass are still de rigueur. Most is not all. It is, well, just most. Now, in some synagogues, people wear their masks into the buildings and lower them as services begin to their noses. But in most synagogues, there's still, throughout the prayers, they are ultimately wearing their masks. It is the seating that has changed. Most people are attending, and distances between worshipers have gotten smaller, 3 feet, not 6 feet, really. Synagogues that had closed their doors to in-person prayer and relied on Zoom prayers have begun to resume in-house services. Now there are two alternatives: attending in person if you feel comfortable, leaving your bubble, Zooming, of course, for those not yet willing to venture out. Divrei Torah and sermons delivered from the pulpit have started. They've been reinstituted. Not long, drawn-out sermons, but well-prepared, pithy, and to-the-point teachings. Children have returned to synagogues, banished for the past year. Pesach was the breakout moment. In most cases, announcements inviting them back were not sent out. It just happened, spontaneous, and almost across the board. It was as if the Haggadah's Dayenu had an additional stanza. Dayenu, enough. We kids coming back. As a result, synagogues have scrambled to reinitiate children's programming, that is, at least safely. Looking at them, masked, on lollipop sticks sticking out of their mouths underneath their masks, made me realize how resourceful we can be when we want to be, and we want to have a lollipop. Complaints and compliance. I've heard it all the time about the dangers that they present. Rather, this time, it's about the rules being broken, standing too close to the bima when the Torah is being read, kissing the mezuzah when walking into the building. These are the complaints. Eating a boxed takeaway kiddush clusters rather in the street as opposed to at home. But those complaints are being dealt with, some with new, more relaxed rules. Lucky, the confluence of these vaccinations, cabin fever, change in session, and change in season has resulted in organized outdoor activities for many congregations. The Perek in the park is just one example. Outdoor picnic Shabbat lunches. A few friends gathered and comfortably distanced, sharing food and wine is another. Perek, as if often referred to, has long been a springtime feature of synagogues. It is an outside, late afternoon, on Sabbath activity, social gathering during which people gather to hear a presentation and then nosh. And Perek in the park has made a comeback. The weather is nice, the cherry blossoms are blooming, the venue is outdoors, the population is starved for content, and more of them are vaccinated. But are enough people vaccinated? Is what people are doing really safe? Or is it too soon? Has impatience gotten the best of us? It's too soon to say. People are much less afraid than they were last Pesach, less than they were even 2 months ago. And so tensions have been reduced. Certainly COVID is still among us, and there are still spikes. The virus is still raging, and yes, even some of those people have been vaccinated are still testing positive and getting sick. But thankfully, mercifully, fewer and fewer people are dying. Deaths are down, morbidity is down, but that does not mean that we should let our guard all the way down and pull our masks totally off. We're not yet totally out of danger, but we are, for the first time in a long time, hopeful and optimistic. Let's be smart too. Let's proceed with caution and with wisdom. I've also been thinking about Israel and Iran. The two countries, Israel and Iran, are engaged in a shadow war. It's a war like no other war. It's a war that is waged behind the scenes and through the use of proxies. It's a conflict in which neither side takes responsibility for their military attacks. Israel and Iran are walking a tiptoe tightrope, delicately maneuvering so as not to escalate the situation and be forced out of the shadows and into an all-out confrontation. Part of the shadow war is messaging, and Israel has sent a message to Iran and to her friends. The message is, surprisingly, as clear as can be given the fact that it's conducted in shadows. There are 4 parties to this message. 4. First and foremost, of course, is Iran. Second is the Muslim countries in the region. Third is Russia and China. And fourth is the United States. When it comes to Iran, Israel and the United States are no longer in sync. Over the past few months, Iran presumably has attacked 2 Israeli commercial ships in the region. The ships were hit above the waterline. They were not shot by submarines or torpedoes. They may have been hit by missiles, but most probably the most reliable reports that the attacks came by way of limpet mines. These are landmines that are surreptitiously attached to the ship and then sometime later blown up. Limpet mines would fit the modus operandi of none other than the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC. They have in the past used small rubber boats, speedboats, which zip under the radar and attack large vessels. The IRGC has even attacked U.S. Navy ships in this matter. In June of 2019, a U.S. naval ship in the Gulf of Oman was hit by these limpet mines. In fact, there is a video which shows the IRGC removing a mine from the side of a U.S. naval ship because it had not exploded. It failed to explode. In response to that attack, President Trump ordered an airstrike. He had reached his limit. Fighter jets were dispatched, and as they were on their way to hit their targets, they were called back. The then president's advisors had prevailed, and they had calmed the president down. And so, when the Iranian vessel, the MV Savas, was attacked recently, fingers pointed towards Israel. It was Israel, but Jerusalem will neither deny nor confirm responsibility, and the Israelis do not leave fingerprints. Israel needed to act. After all, 2 of their commercial ships have been attacked, and that's when and why and how they need to send their message, their very strong message. The damage done to the MZ Savage was greater than the damage that had been done to the Israeli ships. This was a surgical strike at the ship's engine room. It totally incapacitated the ship. The MZ Savage took on water in the engine room alone, but did not sink and will not sink. The damage allowed the ship to be towed and fixed. According to Iranian press releases, the Savage is a cargo ship, but every country other than Iran knows it's a floating naval base. The Tasnim, actually an official Iranian media site, links it to the Revolutionary Guard. They reported that the Savage is in the mouth of the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aden, near the coast of Djibouti. On one side is Yemen, and on the other side is that. Now, this is an amazing and important element, which was sent out ultimately in order to prevent piracy, so they said. In the name of the ship, actually, Saviz means friendly. It's out of commission now for a few months and will hurt Iran's strategic objectives. Photos and videos of the deck of the Savage show rubber boats of the IRGC. The Savage is both a forward operating headquarters and, at the same time, an intel gathering station. It most often moves slowly or remains stationary. Among the many missions tasked to the ship is monitoring and directing Iranian operations in Yemen. It looks like a cargo tanker, but it's hardly delivering cargo. Israel's message was a clear and precise method of attack. Israel controlled every aspect of the attack. This was not a random hit anywhere on the ship. The Israeli strike knocked out what they needed to knock out. No one was injured and no one was killed. The message to Iran is that Israel can and will strike them anywhere. They are not afraid to take military action at any time, and they will not be placated, pacified, or persuaded, or talked down by the United States. The message to the region is that Israel is not afraid of Iran. They are not afraid to strike Iran. Israel will protect their own interest and the interest of their allies in the region, because Israel is the most significant, capable, and precise force in the region. And unlike other countries in the area, Israel is not afraid to act. The message to Russia and China is that if they want to be Iran's allies, they need to rein Iran in. They cannot allow Iran to get out of control. There are consequences, not only to Iran, but also to Russia and Chinese interests. It will be great. The message to the United States is that the US may want a nuclear deal and may be scampering to resuscitate the Iranian deal and have them return to the deal, but neither that will limit the influence of Israel's responsibility to defend itself, its citizens, and its interests. If that means attacking Iran and teaching Iranian leadership a message and a lesson, so be it. That lesson will be learned. Israel is not impressed by the renewed nuclear talks. Israel does not believe that an agreement, any agreement Iran signs, will be signed or carried out in good faith. Israel is wary of Iran and wary of her shenanigans. Israel is not afraid of Iran. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the New York Times. It was written by Isabel Kirshner, and it was published April 5th, 2021, and is titled, My Life in Israel's Brave New Post-Pandemic Future. Isabel has been part of the New York Times Jerusalem Bureau for, I would guess, 30 years. This column addresses a very real and consuming issue for Israelis, and that issue is Israel's green passport. Online, this column was entitled, A Green Pass Allows Us, the Vaccinated, to go to concerts, restaurants, and sporting events, but Israel's real-time experiment in post-lockdown living leaves many questions unanswered. That's the title. The dateline is Tel Aviv. Kirshner begins by setting the stage at a concert in the post-pandemic Israeli metropolis of Tel Aviv. She writes, as the lights dimmed and the music started up, an audible wave of excitement rippled through the crowd. Somebody, a few rows above, ululated with joy, as if at the Middle Eastern wedding. I had come to Tel Aviv's Bloomfield Soccer Stadium for a concert by Dikla, an Israeli singer of Iraqi and Egyptian origins, which was hailed by the city as a celebration of the comeback of culture. It was the first live performance I had attended in over a year. There were only 500 vaccinated Israelis in the stadium that ordinarily seats 30,000 people, but it felt strange and exhilarating to be in the crowd of any size after a year of intermittent lockdowns. It was a live concert, but pretty empty by design to keep proper social distancing. The audience was confined to their socially distanced seats, dancing in place and singing along through their masks. But the atmosphere was exuberant, and it confirmed my status as a member of a new privileged class, the fully vaccinated. We, a group that includes more than half of Israel's 9 million people, are getting a taste of a post-pandemic future. Now Kirshner explains what the Green Passport, or Green Pass, as it's often called, really is. She continues, membership in the class is certified by the Green Pass, a document you can download and carry in your phone. It includes a sort of GIF, a little moving animation of green people walking along, looking like a happy, fully vaccinated family. Israel's vaccination program has been remarkably swift and successful. Kirshner explains that life is approaching normal in Israel. The country is opening up and life is returning to some sense of normalcy. This is how she puts it. In recent weeks, new cases of COVID have dropped dramatically, from a peak of 10,000 a day in January to a few hundred by late March. The economy has almost fully reopened. Just as Israel became a real-world laboratory for the efficacy of the vaccine, it is now becoming a test case for the post-lockdown, post-vaccinated society. The Green Pass is your entry ticket. Green Pass holders may dine indoors in restaurants, stay in hotels, and attend indoor and outdoor cultural, sports, and religious gatherings in the thousands. We can go to gyms, swimming pools, and the theater. We can get married in wedding halls. We celebrated the spring holidays of Passover and Easter in the company of family and friends. Remember where this column is printed. Kirshner And the New York Times can't resist making a comparison between Israel and the Palestinians. But she does not dwell on the subject for too long or too harshly. It is almost a passing thought, but it's there. She has to remind us about the Palestinians and the vaccinations. In the remainder of the column, Isabel Kirshner explores the serious ethical questions surrounding the green passport. Is it right to distinguish between those who elect not to take the vaccine and those who do? Is it right not to permit them full access to work or life in Israel? She writes, the holdouts present tricky moral and legal questions. Should they have the right to rejoin the world too? Is it ethical to discriminate against them? Or is it fair to force those who have done everything they could to protect themselves by getting vaccinated to share space with people who chose not to? Kirshner concludes with an explanation of just how blessed and lucky she feels in Israel. Of course, she does not use those exact words, but it's certainly her implication when she concludes by writing, I feel a personal sense of lightness and relief as I go about my new vaccinated life. I even caught myself the other day in the supermarket without my mask on, which is still required in public places. We're all living in splendid isolation. Virus restrictions still make most traveling a daunting proposition, and non-Israelis generally cannot enter the country. I miss my family overseas. Until the rest of the world catches up, we are a nation living in a bubble. Next up is a column from Ynet. The writer is Elior Levy, and it was published on April 1st, 2021. The piece is about Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority's upcoming elections. It's entitled, Abbas finds himself up the creek without a paddle ahead of the PA polls. Analysis, despite warnings from Israel and his own advisors, Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas is racing towards the Palestinian polls with a broken and divided faction, while terror groups, Hamas, demonstrates a united front unlike its successful 2006 round. As an important point of information, the PA election is divided into two sections. The parliamentary election, where people vote for the Legislative Council, will take place on May 22nd. The presidential election will take place on July 31st. Keep that in mind as we examine Levy's column. So Levy begins. History repeats itself, first as a tragedy and then as a farce, the old saying goes, which seems to describe the course of events in the Palestinian Authority to a T. Despite all warnings, past experience, and myriad of red flags, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah arrives with money and plenty of time, but the Palestinian legislative election is broken, divided, and ridden with infighting. Levy explains just how fractured the Palestinian election process is. He writes, meanwhile, Fatah's political rival, the terrorist organization Hamas, is heading into elections united, strong, and itching for a fight. 36 parties have submitted their list for the upcoming election before the final deadline. While Hamas is running as one united list, Fatah split into three bickering parties. The main list is, of course, led by Abbas, another led by Marwan Barghouti, who is currently serving 5 life sentences in Israeli prison, and ousted member Nasser al-Qadda. And the third list is led by President exiled arch-rival Mohammed Dahlan. And while Barghouti and Dahlan themselves are not running for parliament, they did create the lists and pick their own candidates to serve as their proxies. Levy then walks through the issues, describing and giving insight into the anti- and non-democratic elements within the parties and their candidates. Most importantly, he points out that Hamas is gaining popularity and they are totally anti-democratic. From Levy's point of view, whatever the results of these elections are, none of them are good for Israel, because the results could easily lead to a crisis within the Palestinian world. Levy concludes this way. In any case, Jerusalem must prepare for a scenario in which Hamas gains the upper hand. Such a victory may not be accepted even within the Palestinian society, which will lead to deep destabilization in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Because as we know, a fire within the Palestinian society has a way of scorching Israel. An excellent column and perfect, wonderful insight. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 5 cartoons today. First up is a cartoon poking fun at the return to in-person learning schools. This has been a very long and very hard time for students of all ages. Finally, in-person learning has begun. In this cartoon, the teacher welcomes some students back to school. The title of the cartoon is America's Schools Almost Normal. One student holds up his hand as if to say, "Stop. Whoa, not so fast." A second student holds out his hand and asks, "Let me see your vaccine report." Unfortunately, this is a perfect example of humor being totally based on reality. Second cartoon is a play on politics and sports, and of course, the moving of the All-Star game from Georgia to Colorado. Two men are in the bar. One of them is decked out in boycott sports material petitions. Oh, you got it. It's all over. He is obviously asking the second guy to sign the petition. The guy says, I'm not really into sports. The first guy says, oh, so you're not political, huh? Unfortunately, this is great insight into our new world where sports have become political. This next cartoon is one of many that have a common theme and depiction. It's what we call a genre cartoon. A U.S. track and field runner is on the track, almost at the finish line. He's standing still and celebrating. Running up quickly behind him is the Green Reaper with his sickle of death in hand. Again, in our world as we live it, so similar, so many things, so many people have been vaccinated, so many areas that are spiked. And while we know people are getting ill and people are testing positive, things are still getting much better. Next cartoon is a play on the famous Rodin sculpture called The Thinker. The Thinker has come to get his COVID vaccine, and he is, of course, thinking. The vaccine administrator is there with the needle in hand and says, take your time. It obviously must be a difficult choice for you. Sitting next to the administrator is the Grim Reaper with the sickle, and on his desk is the placard, COVID. It's a simple choice, vaccine or get sick and maybe even die. This last cartoon makes fun of the immigration situation in the US, but here it's on the moon. A US moon rover is traversing the landscape on the moon. Two alien space creatures look out and say to one another, I wish they would respect our immigration laws. That's funny. Some of the cartoons touched on political issues, and I do this every week. Of course they do. I'm not endorsing a political opinion or a point of view. I bring them because they are poking fun at the situation. Humor is an essential part of our lives. Humor keeps us sane. Humor enables us to address issues that we may disagree on in a friendly, not controversial or confrontational manner. Disagreement is good, but must be done with respect, and humor allows us to do that, at least good humor. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. In 2018, then President Trump stopped all aid to the Palestinians. Now things are about to change. The Biden administration has announced that they have a plan to give $235 million to the Palestinians. This is the second time in 1 week that the Biden administration announced the granting of money to the Palestinians. First, they promised $15 million. Now they're promising, this plan calls for even more. There's a plan with $150 million to the United Nations Relief Agency, this is UNRWA, $75 million to the United States Economic Support Aid, and $10 million in development funding. These figures came to light in a notice emailed by the administration to congressional offices. The U.S. State Department has said that the monies are legal and in line with U.S. policy towards the Palestinians. The P5+1 met with Iran in Vienna recently. They met to take a look at the nuclear deal. The talks were so successful they decided to meet again in a few days, and again and again. The P5+1 are the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus 1, Germany. Iran and these major powers will continue to discuss ways to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. The former President Trump abandoned in 2018. Following the initial meeting, Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, Abbas Araghchi, told Iranian television, quote, the talks in Vienna were constructive. He added that Tehran would not suspend its enrichment of uranium to 20% fissile purity in return for the release of $1 billion of its funds blocked in other countries because of U.S. sanctions reimposed on Iran since 2018. Interestingly, Iran is running this show, and they are holding strong. Iran announced a 10-day lockdown. The announcement was made after the fourth wave of COVID hit the country very, very hard. This information was made public by state media. Using state media in this way is not a typical way for Iran to send messages. Under normal circumstances, Iran would not want outsiders to know the extent of their damage and the enormity of the threat of COVID. But COVID is not normal, and they needed to inform the public of the shutdown, so they bit the bullet and used the media for all to see. The decision was made to shutter 23 of 31 provinces for 10 full days. The shuttering means no schools, no theater, no sports, closing all public areas. Ramadan begins in the midst of this closure. This year, that means that there will be no family gatherings together after they break fasts, as is the custom. This will be a psychological pain. The closure will surely have harsh impact on the people of Iran. Jordan's crown prince, King Abdullah's half-brother, Hamza bin Hussein, was put under house arrest recently. An investigation against him was opened. The visit by the head of the army to the home of the crown prince was made public for the entire country to witness. Everyone needed to see that King Abdullah does not tolerate any challenge to his leadership. The crime Crown Prince Hamza bin Hussein committed was posting an online serious critique of Jordanian leadership, claiming that it was corrupt. The backstory is, not too long ago, Prince Hamza was removed from the line of succession after attempting to position himself for the kingship, and maybe even ousting his half-brother, King Abdullah. When King Abdullah discovered Hamza's newest challenge to his leadership, the king's hand was forced, and he had to act to make an example. The story is still developing. There are rumors being spread that the situation between the two brothers is on the mend. Hamza publicly signed a letter pledging support for the king. There is little tolerance in Jordan for those who challenge the king. House arrest is getting off easy. The police and the Justice Department in Norway fined their prime minister for violating COVID restrictions after Prime Minister Erna Solberg held a party to celebrate her 60th birthday. 13 members of her family were in attendance. Solberg was fined 20,000 Norwegian crowns, which comes to about $2,500, a little less. The Prime Minister had apologized, but Norwegian leadership and the Justice Department knew that her apology was not enough. They knew that the country cannot have a situation where there are two sets of rules. That's why they chose to fine the Prime Minister and make her punishment public. So they needed to fine her and make her a public example. Gatherings are limited to 10 people, and they would not tolerate any exceptions. The irony of the situation is that the Prime Minister has been on the front line insisting that people act responsibly during COVID. That's the reason. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. I spoke earlier about showing respect even while in disagreement with someone. Respect is an essential Jewish value. It's best understood as seen through the behavior of Hillel and Shammai, two great rabbis of the Mishnah, the last of the partners, the last of the pairs, they're called, the last of the zugot. During their lifetimes, these great rabbis disagreed constantly. After their deaths, their schools led continued disagreements, each with the other, of analysis and interpretation of law, of Jewish law. And they did so with respect. So much so that the Mishnah explains that their children intermarried. And the Mishnah actually holds them up as a great example of disagreement, l'shem shamayim, in the name of heaven, for heaven's sake. As a sign of respect, when an issue was in dispute, the school of Hillel would study both their analysis and the analysis of the Shammai school. They would study both sides and would actually begin with Shammai's point of view. That way, it was not and didn't seem to be adversarial. It seemed to be a point-counterpoint. We should strive to do the same. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.